Welcome to Systems Philosophy. Throughout these introductory episodes, I've been leaning very heavily on biological processes, evolution in particular, because evolution is the original model, life on Earth, the first systems we know of. And biomimicry, imitation, is a big part of how we can utilize the things that life has invented, discovered, evolved over the last billions of years and incorporate them into our thinking. This is an important part of my personal sort of thinking and philosophy, which is why we've been so heavily biased towards the evolutionary side of things. In this episode, I'm going to focus again on culture and technology as a unit, as a separate framed entity, even though culture doesn't exist without the humans that carry it, without the minds that store and act as the computer for it, the information systems hardware. It can be abstracted, and the abstraction provides useful insights. Okay, so if we consider culture as an entity, and that entity is tied, at least initially, to, let's track it back in evolution. From parent to offspring, culture is tightly coupled to the parental line. So that way genetics that builds the body is tightly coupled in a feedback loop to the culture and brain that stores and transmits the lessons learned in a single life and keeps them alive over multiple lifetimes. If the individual dies, their culture dies with them. There might be other siblings from that particular litter or whatever group that parenting sort of work towards. So a single death need not wipe out culture because parents have many offspring. Now, if we translate the culture to a group dynamic, instead of sort of transmitting and mutating and being tightly coupled to individual biology, in something like a troop of monkeys, the culture is carried and transmitted in the group overall. Yes, you would still get a degree of parent to offspring transmission, but mainly the culture is groups. Monkeys work in groups, they interact all the time, they're highly sociable. And we can see that nature evolves group-based behaviour and thinking. So as the culture explores what is capable within the group setting as opposed to the individual parent-offspring setting in evolutionary terms, not only does it now depend also on group fitness, it becomes more of a group phenomenon. So the troop of monkeys, if they are for some reason wiped out, which is a lot harder to do than the individual, the cultural speciality of that troop would also be lost. We can perhaps see that more clearly in orca, killer whales, where pods have individual dialects and cultures, hunting techniques. If the pod is wiped out, that technique is lost and another pod needs to learn it. So we see culture being coupled to groups which themselves consist of individuals which are constructed from genes. So we have a sort of a hierarchically nested, networked systems stack that supports culture. So you can visualize that in computer hardware terms as individual operating systems, for instance, being, well, it's harder to try to get the direct analogy, but perhaps a family of processors. So the Intel processors will have certain software sets and drivers that Intel creates for them, and they get put into certain machines, and those machines have certain low-level software that runs on them. They also participate on the internet and in networks. So as well as having the machines that are tied to the processor, we have an abstraction layer that is independent of the processor architecture, that acts more in terms of the generation and the economic niche of the computer. So if it's a personal computer or a phone, then they provide sort of physical constraints to the type of cost performance trade-offs, and so we can have certain behaviours that phones can carry, and then those phones can, independent of their brand and processor, participate things like the Apple Store and Google. I've forgotten the Google Store. Is it Google Play? Whatever the ecosystem is. So now we have a sort of a broader ecology that then itself goes into the broader ecology of software that goes across all the different vendors. It doesn't matter whose phone it is. You'll probably find a version of the Brave browser, for instance, that runs on it. Internet sites are common. So I'm trying now to give you the sort of parallel between the way technology functions and the way that culture and biology function. And of course, culture and biology enable technology. So we have just extended the stack when we're talking technology. And the concept is you have vertical integration, the cells in my body, the original fertilized egg, which is a single cell, grows into a full billions of cell colony that is cloned into my body, which is a coordinated information structure that persists and maintains itself despite injury and disturbance over time. And yes, we grow from baby to old man. So there is a process to that integrated field, which itself is part of the evolutionary reflexive feedback mechanism. Okay, so a lot of this has been reaching into previous episodes and previous concepts we've built upon, this time trying to look at culture as an abstraction and find how it's anchored. So everything is everything. The only reality is reality. The map is not the territory. The framing doesn't represent truth. It represents at the most a version of truth, a sort of thesis or theory, a mental framework for understanding a certain aspect of reality. And the framing I'm presenting around culture works the same way. All right. So my thesis is that once culture became an information field that was transmitted over the group, then that information field started to impact the biology of the individuals of the group. And I've already in previous episode quoted the lactose tolerance gene of showing how the culture of drinking milk from non-human mammals can go back right down to the level of genetics, not even the behavioural level of keeping cows and milking them and making cheese and all the other things that get culturally stored, the technology of building barns and milking machines, all associated with drinking milk. And it's not just cows, it's mare's milk, camel's milk, goat's milk, sheep's milk. Milk has been pervasive, reindeer milk. So the whole human innovation of supplementing our food supply using the milk of mammals and not just their meat has been discovered over and over again, like some evolutionary niche in culture, and the technologies and techniques have followed. So we have a clear feedback mechanism between what culture does, what cultural learning persists, biology and genetics. Everything is reflexively coupled, which means that one change affects the other, which feeds back to the original change. It's like everything is connected, that old meme. So, in this episode, I want to focus specifically on culture as a thing, as an entity, much like I am an entity. I have a clear life, a clear being, clear boundaries in my skin. Culture is perhaps not so well defined. It's a little bit more difficult to visualize, but it is an information field, just like I am. The information field learns, it remembers, it adapts, and this is where systems and cybernetics theory come in, because we don't deny that AI technology is building powerful individual pieces of software which have various release versions that are being evolved and adapted. Each software has its own lifetime, if you like. At the time of this recording, we're up to GPT 5.6 with various models showing different sort of strengths, different market segments. And that model is a field. We don't have to worry about which hardware it runs on, and OpenAI has even got different substrates that it's experimenting with. We have a new massive wafer chip technology called Cerebrus, which is basically a computer the size of a wafer. There are some technical challenges, but huge speed trade-offs. And then we have the classic NVIDIA sort of family of AI-specific processors. Hopper, I forget all the names, I don't want to go into them, that's a sidetrack. So we have the hardware that carries the software, and we have software generations that are evolving. And then we have the training data in the software that is also being carried. So we have similar dynamics. Culture works the same way. We have the information field, the language, the traditions, the beliefs, the technologies, and the practices that surround things like how we treat our children, how we interact with each other, what taboos do we have, what foods do we eat, how do we farm, how do we make war, what goes into what weapons and weapons technology do we have access to. So at even the tribal band, if two tribes go to war, and I've discussed war, you can have a clear winner or loser. You can have one culture get set back to the point where it might not survive the next famine. And often wars are associated with scarcity. When there is plenty, then there's plenty for all and no pressure for resources. When resources are scarce, then pilfering, stealing, acquiring territory and resources from neighbouring living entities is as old as the lobster who holds territory. Territorial disputes and ant wars are a thing, and human wars are well documented, and so are tribal disputes and wars. So if tribes fight, often the winning culture can even subsume the females and possibly slaves in smaller tribes, are taken into the larger winning tribe, and the winning culture survives. So this is the sort of dynamics taken from a cultural perspective. A culture competes with the culture of other tribes, so now we're taking the high level view. If resources are scarce, the cultural operating system considers its chances in obtaining resources by either migrating, exploring new opportunities, so modifying itself, or, like I just said, going to war, or simply raiding, stealing. The Vikings were famous for raiding, and the main raiding period was during a period of particularly harsh climate in the 800s and 900s, where their far northern European agriculture and hunting and fishing subsistence was threatened, and they needed to survive, and so they chose to go a Viking, which is not the name of a people but the name of a practice, the practice of sea raiding or boat raiding. I suppose they used rivers as much as they did the oceans. So cultures fight, cultures compete, cultures consume each other, cultures interact, they swap technology. Although, given that cultures fight, we can see from our current day that technology, information is power. We have legal structures like patents that protect information within a culture. We have espionage that tries to find out secrets from other cultures, and the fact that we have espionage, spies, means that cultures also protect their secrets. If you have a particular military advantage in weaponry, then that advantage is important if you should ever come into conflict with the neighbouring culture, which is almost a certainty given historical lessons. In a previous episode, I talked about Aborigines in the desert. Water in the desert is life, especially during dry times where war is more likely. And what they did, perhaps still do, is they carefully disguised and covered water holes so that water sources were not obvious, things like rock seeps and springs, precious sources of water that can mean the difference between life and death. It means that individual tribal members can scatter to the deep desert should they be invaded, regroup and perhaps retake their land. But it also means that invaders cannot cross much of the dry country. So protecting the knowledge of water sources at the tribal level is just as important as protecting the knowledge of how to make a better bow or a better arrow. Knowledge is power, and while knowledge can be exchanged, as can goods between cultures and tribes, there is an incentive structure, a game dynamic, an evolutionary feedback mechanism where cultures that are too open will lose whatever advantage they have and might be conquered by other cultures. And we can see it. Some cultures are deceptive, some cultures are aggressive, some cultures are cooperative. So individual cultures have different belief systems that then drive different overall behaviours, because the belief systems, like the sports team that you support, is something that is often culturally imprinted. We support the team that represents our city. It shows that you have loyalty to your local culture. That is not just a cultural legacy, I dare say it's also largely a biological legacy, because cultures where people can easily defect are cultures that don't survive, because the grass is always greener on the other side. When we look at ourselves naked in the mirror, we see all the imperfections. And when we see others at a distance clothed, they always look perfect. That's the same saying, just put in a perhaps more crass way. So we have all these dynamics that suggest cultures need to maintain coherence, and our biology will adapt, because people who betray their culture, betray their people, betray their beliefs, will form parts of cultures that get defeated, no longer exist in the evolutionary tree. Evolution and the search algorithm tests the fitness of all the cultural structures at once. And whatever the fitness test, be it the ability to grow a certain size population given your environment, to overcome hardships like drought, to resist invasion, perhaps even to conquer and invade, because even though our morality says that is not desirable, it is still practiced, and therefore you could say that evolution is amoral in a sense, in that it's the law of the jungle, and whatever works and persists goes. We have predators and parasites and disease as much as all the good moral thinking. The fact that such strong morality and moral principles exist within humanity, for me personally, is a sign that culture has selected for it. So it's not a sign of weakness, that the law of the jungle is one particular framing. We need to be aware of situations where warfare and raw aggression, the law of the jungle applies, but cultural cooperation and negotiation with potential enemies is, well, has historically been a big feedback mechanism to the survival of the cultures that persist to this day, which is why we have the moral structures, including intuitive moral structures, because cultural morals, like the lactose tolerance tree gene, go back to temperament. Just look at dog temperament. Dogs that traditionally were part of fighting pits have a certain temperament, like the pit bull, despite what people say about the individuals. Dogs that were used in hunting and tracking have a certain temperament, and then dogs that were used as family companions have a temperament. So we have clear examples in the evolution and domestication of the dog, how the original wild, intuitive, instinctive behaviours of the wolf have been modified in the genetics of the dog. And yes, dogs are cultural creatures, and you can abuse them. You can turn them into guard dogs. You can turn them into junkyard dogs, to use a meme. But you can also socialise and keep them peaceful, just like people. So there is definitely a huge degree of flexibility on top of the genetic behavioural tendencies, but the genetics nonetheless exists. Okay, so I think that just about does it. This episode has been focused on looking at culture as a being, like I am a being. It's a framing, but it's also something that shows true systems dynamics. The fact that we have us and them, in and out groups, means that there is a group of culture that protects its own beliefs, and even subcultures can work the same way within the vast societies that we have built today, that are far greater than the tribal Dunbar's number cultures that most of our historical evolution has been reflexively feeding back to our biology for. One of the dynamics of the biological evolution is it's somewhat slow. It takes multiple generations to adapt, especially when we have the gene pool needs to have certain genes that can be recessive and re-emerge. So you need consistent pressure over multiple generations in order to significantly shift even the gene pool of a tribe. This has been systems philosophy,